The sky over the rocky valley was heavy with dark clouds, and the wind blew sharply, carrying a cold that seemed to cut through everything. Elias moved carefully across the jagged terrain, his boots crunching over stones and broken branches. He had been searching for hours, but the valley seemed empty. The storm from last night had been worse than anyone expected, and now he feared the worst. The young dragon hatchlings he had been entrusted with were missing. Their soft cries had vanished into the night, leaving only silence and fear behind. The dragons that had grown older waited at the edge of the cliff, their bodies tense and glowing faintly in a rhythm that reflected sorrow. They were elegant and powerful, yet now they seemed fragile. Elias watched them, feeling the weight of their grief. Each glowing scale on their bodies flickered with emotion, a silent language only those who had lived alongside them could understand. He knelt and spoke softly, though he knew the words might not reach the lost hatchlings. "I will find them. I promise," he said. His voice trembled, but he had to hold on to hope, however small. The valley stretched endlessly in front of him, filled with shadows cast by the storm-damaged cliffs. He followed a trail of broken twigs and scorched grass, signs that something had passed through recently. Every step made his heart beat faster with fear and anticipation. The storm had been strong, but it was not enough to erase every trace. Elias crouched near a large boulder, listening carefully. There was nothing. Just the wind, sighing through the rocks, and the quiet whine of the dragons nearby. Elias remembered the hatchlings, tiny creatures with scales like sunlight and eyes that glowed softly in the dark. They had been full of life, playful and curious, learning from the older dragons and trusting him without question. He had watched over them with care, guiding them, feeding them, and teaching them the ways of their kind. Now, without them, the valley felt empty and cold, as if a piece of its soul had been stolen. He clenched his fists and tried to ignore the despair creeping into his chest. There was no time to grieve, not fully. He had to keep moving. As he pressed forward, he noticed small footprints in the soft earth near a stream. They were tiny and delicate, almost invisible, but he recognized them immediately. His heart lifted slightly. "They were here," he whispered. "Some of them survived." The older dragons stirred, sensing the change in his emotions. They let out low, soft roars, a mix of warning and encouragement. Elias followed the trail carefully, stepping lightly so as not to disturb anything that could be alive nearby. The storm had left the valley littered with debris, rocks shifted, and branches broken. Each step forward was a challenge, but Elias could not stop. He moved toward a darker part of the canyon, where the cliffs rose sharply, forming a narrow passage. The air was thick with the scent of wet stone and damp earth. He paused, listening. A faint sound reached his ears, almost like a whisper, almost like a cry. He held his breath and strained to hear. It came again, soft and tiny. "Little ones," he muttered, voice barely audible. He crawled over a fallen tree trunk, careful not to make noise. The older dragons followed from a distance, keeping a watchful eye on the surroundings. Every sense was alert. Elias could feel the fear and hope mingling inside him. He had been trained to survive in harsh conditions, but this was different. These were not just creatures he protected, they were like family. And now they were alone, vulnerable, and scared. The passage narrowed, and he had to squeeze through between two large rocks. The faint cry grew clearer, and he realized it was coming from a small crevice, almost hidden in the shadows. Elias reached the spot and saw the first hatchling, curled up and shivering, its tiny wings pressed against its body. Its eyes opened slowly, glowing faintly, and it blinked at him with confusion and recognition. Elias carefully lifted the hatchling, holding it close. Its warmth spread to his hands, and he could feel a small heartbeat, fast and irregular but alive. Relief washed over him. More tiny shapes appeared, hiding in the rocks. One by one he gathered them, speaking softly, trying to calm their fear. The hatchlings clung to him instinctively, curling against his chest and arms. Their scales glimmered faintly, and their eyes reflected trust and relief. Elias felt tears prick at his eyes. The valley was still harsh, the storm had passed, but hope was returning. He knew that this was only the beginning. He had found them, but now he had to keep them safe. The older dragons approached, surrounding them in a protective circle. Their glowing patterns shifted, reflecting emotions that words could not describe. They had mourned the loss of the hatchlings, but now their sorrow was mixed with cautious joy. Elias looked at them and smiled, though his body ached and his mind was exhausted. He whispered, "We are not done yet, but we are together. That is enough for now." The sun began to rise, breaking through the clouds, casting light on the wet rocks and damp earth. The hatchlings yawned and nuzzled into his chest, finally quiet. For the first time since the storm, Elias allowed himself a moment of peace. The valley was still dangerous, still full of unknown threats, but for now there was life, there was hope, and there was a bond that could not be broken. Elias stood slowly, holding the hatchlings close. The older dragons flanked him, their glowing bodies creating a soft, protective circle. He looked toward the horizon, knowing that the journey ahead would be difficult. Yet in that quiet moment, as the hatchlings slept on his chest and the valley began to awaken with the light of dawn, Elias felt a deep sense of connection and purpose. He had survived the storm and he had saved them. Together they would face whatever came next. The valley was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. Life had returned, fragile but strong, and Elias knew that the silent grief of the past night had given way to a fragile but unbreakable hope. Elias walked slowly through the valley, the hatchlings still asleep against his chest. Their tiny bodies were warm, fragile, and trusting, and he could feel each heartbeat, rapid but steady. The storm had passed, but the ground was uneven, littered with rocks and fallen branches. Every step required care, every glance searched for danger. He had learned that nature was unpredictable here, but he also knew that these mountains held secrets, sometimes good, sometimes deadly. The older dragons flanked him, their glowing scales casting soft light across the wet stones. They moved silently, alert to every sound, every vibration in the earth. Elias noticed that their glances were not just protective, they were searching. He realized that they were looking for something he could not see. Perhaps they knew more about the hatchling's disappearance than he did. Their quiet humming roars carried an emotion he could not fully name, a mix of hope and fear. As he moved, Elias spotted a trail of small footprints in the mud. They were not his own, and they were not the older dragons. These were the footprints of the missing hatchlings. His heart leapt. He knelt, brushing his fingers over the tiny imprints. The mud had hardened slightly in some places, but the tracks were clear enough. He whispered, "They were here. They are still alive." The older dragons stirred beside him, their glow intensifying slightly as if to echo his words. Elias followed the footprints cautiously. They led toward a rocky outcrop, a place shadowed and uneven. The wind whistled through the narrow spaces, carrying scents he could not name. He had been trained to trust his instincts, and every instinct told him to move slowly. Something was watching. Something unseen. He felt it before he could see it, a faint presence that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The hatchlings stirred lightly against his chest, sensing the tension in the air. Elias shushed them softly, holding them closer. The older dragons moved ahead, scanning every crevice and gap. Elias followed their lead, stepping carefully, listening to the echo of his own movement. Then he heard it, a faint rustle like the brushing of tiny wings. He froze. The sound came again, soft and uncertain, almost like a whisper carried by the wind. "Here," he said, pointing toward a narrow opening between two rocks. The older dragons circled the area, their bodies glowing softly, illuminating the shadows. Elias knelt and peered into the opening. Tiny shapes moved just out of reach, small eyes reflecting light briefly before disappearing again. His pulse quickened. He had not imagined it. The hatchlings were alive. They were here. Elias moved closer, careful not to startle them. "It's okay," he murmured. "I'm here. You are safe." The hatchlings responded slowly, stepping out from the shadows. They were weak, shivering, and their scales had dulled from stress and cold, but their trust was immediate. They pressed against him instinctively, seeking warmth and comfort. Elias felt a wave of relief. He could not let them go now. Not ever. The older dragons guided him forward, nudging Elias carefully as he followed the hatchlings. Each step brought more signs of survival. Tiny scratches on rocks where the hatchlings had tried to climb, faint claw marks on the earth, and the soft smell of wet feathers and scales. Elias noted it all, mapping the route in his mind. He understood that the hatchlings had hidden here to survive, following instincts that even he could not fully comprehend. Suddenly a shadow moved above them. Elias looked up and saw shapes flitting along the cliff tops. His heart froze. He could not identify them, but their presence was deliberate. They were not birds, not predators native to the valley. Elias felt a chill run through him. He tightened his grip on the hatchlings, shielding them instinctively. The older dragons flared their wings slightly, creating a protective barrier. Their glowing scales reflected their emotions: alertness, suspicion, and cautious defiance. The hatchlings whimpered softly, sensing the tension. Elias whispered, "Do not worry. I will protect you." He scanned the cliffside carefully. The shadows disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, leaving an uneasy silence. Elias knew that danger might still be near, but for now, he had found signs of life. That was enough to give him hope. That was enough to keep moving. He continued along the rocky path, following the faint movements of the hatchlings and the guidance of the older dragons. The cave ahead was narrow, dark, and partially hidden by overhanging rocks. Elias crouched low, careful not to make noise. The hatchlings were restless, their tiny claws tapping against his chest as they sensed the space ahead. Elias whispered reassurance, telling them everything would be fine. Their trust in him was absolute, and it strengthened his resolve. The passage led to a small opening where sunlight barely reached. Elias paused, noticing the faint sound of breathing that did not belong to him or the older dragons. His heart pounded. He knelt, peering into the shadowy interior. Tiny shapes moved closer, eyes glowing faintly. It was a group of hatchlings huddled together, trembling but alive. Relief flooded him so intensely that he had to swallow hard. He had found them. One by one, Elias extended his hands, letting the hatchlings crawl onto him. They curled against his chest and shoulders, seeking warmth. Their scales shimmered softly in the dim light, tiny bursts of color reflecting emotion. The older dragons watched closely, their glowing patterns shifting, as if expressing cautious happiness. Elias felt a connection so deep that words seemed unnecessary. Life had returned to the valley, fragile but resilient. He stayed there for a moment, holding the hatchlings close, letting them rest. Each small movement, each soft sigh, confirmed they were alive. The shadowy danger might return, but Elias knew he could not let fear control him. He had seen signs of life where all seemed lost, and that hope was more powerful than any threat. The valley, though harsh and empty moments ago, now held the promise of survival. Elias stood slowly, keeping the hatchlings close, and turned to the older dragons. Their eyes met his, understanding passing silently between them. The journey was not over. There were still dangers, still unknowns, but for now they had proof. Life had endured, and trust had guided them through darkness. The hatchlings slept briefly against his chest, the warmth of their tiny bodies a reminder that hope could shine even in the shadow of loss. The sun climbed higher, casting weak light into the rocky canyon. Elias took a deep breath and moved forward carefully, the older dragons flanking him, the hatchlings nestled safely. Every step was deliberate, but the quiet determination in his heart was louder than the fear. They had survived. They had found each other. And now, together, they would continue through the valley, facing whatever might come next, guided by instinct, trust, and hope. Elias moved carefully through the narrow canyon, the hatchlings still sleeping against his chest. Their tiny breaths were soft and steady, and he could feel their small bodies trembling occasionally, a reminder of how close they had come to being lost forever. The older dragons glided beside him, their wings brushing softly against the rocks, glowing faintly to light the shadowed path. Each step forward was careful, measured, because the valley still held dangers he could not see. The hatchlings stirred slightly, tiny claws brushing against Elias's chest. He whispered, "It's okay. You're safe." Their small eyes blinked open, glowing faintly in the dim light. He saw trust and curiosity in them, fragile but strong. The older dragons watched, silent guardians, their scales shimmering with patterns that showed both caution and relief. Elias smiled softly, feeling a deep connection that went beyond words. Ahead, the canyon widened into a small clearing, surrounded by jagged rocks and moss-covered cliffs. Elias approached slowly, noticing movement in the shadows. The hatchlings twitched nervously, sensing something ahead. He crouched low and peeked around a large boulder. His heart jumped. There, huddled together, were the remaining hatchlings, weak, trembling, but alive. Their tiny wings shivered, and their eyes glowed with recognition as they saw him. Elias knelt slowly, holding out his hands. The hatchlings hesitated for a moment, then one by one they crawled toward him, pressing against his chest. He could feel their warmth, fragile and real, and a wave of relief washed over him. The older dragons circled them, their glowing scales flickering in patterns that mirrored their emotions, fear, joy, and cautious hope. Elias whispered softly, "You are safe now. I have found you all." As he held them, Elias noticed signs that the hatchlings had survived on their own. Small piles of moss and leaves indicated where they had tried to make nests. Tiny scratches and marks on the rocks showed that they had climbed and explored, testing their strength even in fear. Elias admired their resilience. Despite the storm and the darkness, they had survived. And now they trusted him completely, curling against him instinctively. The hatchlings' glowing eyes scanned the area, alert but curious. Elias realized that they had begun to understand the world in ways even he could not fully grasp. They sensed the presence of the older dragons and the rhythm of his heartbeat. They trusted instincts he had never seen before. He gently lifted them one by one, holding them close, making sure each felt safe. The older dragons hovered nearby, their wings creating a protective dome around the group. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the canyon. It was soft at first, almost like a whisper, then stronger, scratches against the stone, small and deliberate. Elias tensed. The hatchlings stirred, pressing closer to him. The older dragons flared their wings slightly, their glow intensifying as they scanned the shadows. Elias moved forward slowly, trying to locate the source. Through the rocks, he saw movement, a pair of eyes reflecting light, not like the hatchlings but sharper, alert, calculating. Elias froze, holding the hatchlings tightly. The shadow shifted and disappeared behind a boulder. He realized it was an observer, curious but cautious. Elias knew that the valley was not empty, and other creatures might be watching, testing the boundaries of this human-dragon alliance. He stayed calm, trusting the instincts of the older dragons and the small hatchlings in his arms. He continued through the clearing, stepping carefully over moss and debris. The hatchlings squirmed occasionally, exploring with tiny claws and mouths, testing the warmth of his clothes and the safety of his hands. Elias smiled, marveling at how quickly they had begun to regain strength. They had survived the storm on their own, but now they were safe and he would not let anything harm them. The older dragons followed closely, circling and occasionally letting out soft hums, a mixture of warning and reassurance. Elias reached a small alcove in the canyon wall, hidden by vines and rocks. It was shallow but safe, a perfect temporary shelter. He lowered himself to the ground and set the hatchlings down carefully. They crawled forward, exploring the space with small steps, their wings twitching nervously. Elias watched them closely, making sure they were comfortable. The older dragons landed around the alcove, their bodies forming a protective circle, glowing softly. As he observed, Elias noticed that the hatchling scales began to shimmer with faint colors, brighter than before. He realized that they were reacting to the presence of the older dragons, to his touch, and to the safety of the alcove. They were learning, sensing trust, and growing stronger. The small creatures had endured the storm, had survived alone, and now they were beginning to understand that together they could be safe. Elias felt a surge of hope and pride. He sat quietly, watching the hatchlings curl against each other and his chest, tiny eyes blinking with trust. The older dragons let out soft roars, communicating something Elias could not fully understand, but he felt it in the rhythm of their wings and the glow of their scales. It was a message of survival, of trust, of family. For the first time since the storm, Elias allowed himself to breathe fully, letting the relief and joy wash over him. The sun began to filter through the rocks, casting warm light on the alcove. The hatchlings stirred, stretching tiny wings and yawning, and Elias smiled. They were alive. They had survived the darkness, the storm, and the unknown dangers of the canyon. Now they rested, safe in his arms and in the circle of the older dragons. Elias knew this was only the beginning of their journey, but for the first time he felt a sense of peace. He looked around the clearing, noting every shadow, every stone, every hidden corner. The valley was harsh, but it had offered sanctuary when needed. The hatchlings' trust in him and in the dragons around him was a bond stronger than fear. Elias held them close, feeling the warmth and the small, steady heartbeats. He whispered softly, "You are safe now. Together we can face anything." The older dragons shifted slightly, wings brushing over Elias and the hatchlings, glowing patterns changing as if acknowledging his words. Elias took a deep breath, knowing that the storm was behind them, but the challenges ahead were still unknown. For now, however, the unexpected discovery of the hatchlings alive had brought hope, connection, and a quiet joy that filled the valley. The hatchling settled against his chest, eyes closing in trust and comfort. Elias watched them, feeling a deep bond that needed no words. The older dragons remained vigilant, but the tension in the air had eased. Life had returned, fragile and precious but alive. Elias knew that whatever dangers lay ahead, they had survived the worst, and together they would face the rest. Elias stood in the alcove, the hatchlings resting against his chest. Their small bodies had regained some warmth, but he could still feel the tremble of fear in their muscles. The older dragons hovered around the edges of the clearing, their glowing scales shifting in soft patterns that reflected concern. Elias knew that their reunion was fragile. The valley was not as empty as it seemed, and he could sense danger lurking just beyond sight. A faint sound reached his ears, soft, deliberate, and unnatural. It was not the wind or the echo of the canyon walls. The hatchlings stirred, tiny wings twitching nervously. Elias tightened his hold on them and whispered, "Stay close. Be ready." The older dragons flared their wings slightly, sending waves of soft light across the rocky walls. Their low hums vibrated in the air, a warning to any unseen presence. From the shadows above, shapes began to move. Elias squinted, trying to identify them. They were small, fast, and deliberate, moving with a precision that suggested intelligence. His heart raced. The creatures were unfamiliar, their forms shifting like smoke and shadow. The hatchlings whimpered, sensing the tension, and the older dragons emitted low roars, warning the intruders. Elias knew this was no random encounter. The valley had watchers, and these watchers were testing the strength of the bond between him and the dragons. Elias crouched behind a boulder, keeping the hatchlings close to his chest. He whispered instructions to the older dragons, who immediately understood, circling closer, wings creating a dome of protection. "We need to defend them," he said softly. The hatchlings blinked up at him, sensing urgency, but instinctively stayed calm under the warmth of his touch. Elias felt a surge of determination. He would protect them no matter the cost. The shadowy creatures advanced, moving in coordinated patterns. Elias noticed their sharp eyes tracking his every movement, analyzing the older dragons and calculating the hatchlings' vulnerabilities. He knew that strength alone might not be enough. Strategy, timing, and trust would be critical. The older dragons flared their wings, creating sudden bursts of light that lit up the canyon. The creatures hesitated but did not retreat. Elias realized they needed a plan. He gestured to the older dragons, signaling a synchronized movement he had observed in their training exercises. The dragons responded immediately, diving in patterns that surrounded the intruders. The hatchlings nestled against him, their small bodies glowing faintly, feeding on his confidence. Elias stayed calm, guiding the dragons with subtle movements and soft commands. Together they created a shield of coordinated motion, confusing the watchers above. The shadowy figures made sudden lunges, testing weaknesses, but the dragons were quick. Wings and tails moved in precise arcs, blocking and countering the attacks. Elias stayed low, keeping the hatchlings safe while observing every shift in the shadows. Each movement of the intruders was predictable once he understood their rhythm. He felt a strange exhilaration. Danger was present, but for the first time since the storm he felt in control. Suddenly the ground beneath them shook. A small quake rippled through the canyon, sending dust and debris into the air. The intruders paused, unsure how to respond. Elias seized the moment, signaling the dragons to advance in a coordinated sweep. They moved with grace, forming a protective barrier around the hatchlings. Elias felt the warmth of their glow, their energy mingling with his own, creating a sense of unity that was stronger than fear. The shadowy creatures retreated briefly, circling in the shadows to observe. Elias took the chance to scan the area. He noticed subtle markings on the rocks, traces of the creatures' movement, patterns that suggested intelligence and strategy. They were learning, adapting, testing them. Elias whispered softly to the dragons, "Stay alert. They are testing us, not just attacking." The older dragons flared their wings, creating light pulses that reflected communication. The hatchlings stirred slightly, their small wings brushing against his chest, and he felt a deep bond that strengthened his resolve. The intruders lunged again, faster this time, but Elias and the dragons anticipated it. The synchronized movements blocked the attack, forcing the creatures to hesitate. Elias realized that their unity was more powerful than the intruders' tactics. Each dragon moved with intention, covering the hatchlings while signaling Elias through subtle gestures and glows. The hatchlings felt this energy, their bodies relaxing slightly as they sensed the protective circle. The valley echoed with the sounds of wings, roars, and the subtle vibrations of movement. Elias felt adrenaline coursing through him, but he remained focused. The shadowy figures were intelligent and adaptable, but they had underestimated the bond between human and dragon. Every instinct, every decision, every synchronized motion was a statement. This alliance was not weak and they would defend each other. Gradually the intruders pulled back, circling at the edge of the canyon. Elias and the dragons did not relax, keeping the hatchlings close and their wings spread in readiness. The watchers disappeared temporarily, leaving only faint traces of their presence. Elias knew they might return, but he also knew that the human-dragon bond had proven stronger than their intimidation. He whispered to the hatchlings, "They will not harm you. Together we are stronger." The older dragons lowered their wings slightly, and Elias could see relief in their glowing patterns. The hatchlings snuggled closer to him, tiny hearts beating fast but safe for now. Elias allowed himself a slow breath. The threat had been real, but they had survived. Their bond, trust, and unity had created a shield that even the mysterious intruders could not break. Sunlight filtered through the canyon walls, casting warm beams over the clearing. Elias stood slowly, holding the hatchlings close, their tiny bodies glowing faintly with warmth and energy. The older dragons flared their wings gently, forming a soft circle around him and the hatchlings. Elias felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They had faced danger together and had emerged stronger, their connection unbroken. Elias looked at the horizon, knowing the valley still held unknown threats. The intruders could return or new dangers could appear. But he also knew something powerful. Together, humans and dragons could face the impossible. The hatchlings stirred, blinking their glowing eyes up at him, and he smiled softly. Their trust, fragile and precious, had survived the storm, the darkness, and now the threat. The valley was quiet again, but it was no longer empty. Life, courage, and trust had created a shield stronger than fear. Elias felt the bond between him, the older dragons, and the hatchlings pulse in his chest. Whatever the next challenge, they would face it together. The hatchlings nestled against him, the older dragons forming a protective glow, and for the first time in days, Elias allowed himself a sense of calm, knowing that the threat had been faced and their unity had prevailed. The morning sun rose over the valley, painting the rocks in soft gold and warming the cool air. Elias sat on a large stone, the hatchlings curled against his chest, their tiny bodies glowing faintly in the early light. They had slept through the night, safe and secure, and now stretched their small wings and blinked their glowing eyes up at him. The older dragons hovered nearby, their wings moving slowly, casting shimmering patterns across the valley floor. For the first time in days, the air felt calm. Elias smiled down at the hatchlings, brushing his hand gently over their soft scales. "Good morning," he whispered. They responded with tiny movements, nuzzling him instinctively, showing the trust that had grown between them. He felt a warmth in his chest that went deeper than relief. This was more than survival, it was connection. The bond between human and dragon had been tested and had endured every challenge the valley had thrown at them. The older dragons moved closer, circling Elias and the hatchlings in a protective pattern. Their glowing scales shimmered with colors that spoke of satisfaction, relief, and quiet joy. Elias realized that their bond was more than instinct. The dragons had recognized his courage and care. They understood that he would protect the hatchlings, and he had learned to trust their instincts in return. Together, they were stronger than any storm, any shadowy threat, or any danger the valley could produce. Elias carefully set the hatchlings down on a patch of soft moss. They scrambled a little, testing their wings and hopping over small rocks, but always returning to him when they felt unsure. He laughed softly, the sound echoing in the valley. "You're safe now. You can explore, but don't wander too far," he said. The hatchlings chirped softly, responding in their own language, tiny glowing patterns flickering across their scales. Elias watched in wonder. Even after everything, they were full of life and curiosity. The valley seemed to breathe with them. Birds called in the distance, the wind rustled through trees on the cliff edges, and the sunlight reflected off the rocks and pools of water. Elias realized that this quiet peace was something he had fought for, not just for himself, but for these small creatures and the older dragons who had become his allies. The valley had tested them all, but now it held promise and safety. The older dragons began to interact with the hatchlings, guiding them with soft nudges and low hums. Elias watched as the small dragons began to mimic the older ones' movements, learning to spread their wings, balance on rocks, and understand the rhythms of their environment. It was a slow process, but Elias could see progress. The hatchlings' eyes glowed brighter as they practiced, reflecting joy and confidence. Elias leaned back against a warm rock, the hatchlings curling against him once more. He felt the steady beat of their small hearts and the faint hum of the older dragon's energy nearby. For the first time, he allowed himself to breathe fully, letting the weight of the past days fall away. They had survived storms, fear, and threats. They had endured. And now there was harmony. He glanced at the horizon and noticed the valley stretching far beyond what he had explored. There were cliffs and caves, rivers and fields, waiting to be discovered. Elias thought of the hatchlings growing stronger, the older dragons guiding them, and himself walking beside them. Together they could explore this world, face challenges, and grow. The valley was no longer a place of danger, but a place of life, learning, and unity. The hatchlings climbed onto the older dragons, testing their wings as the larger creatures responded with patience and gentle guidance. Elias watched, amazed at the communication that needed no words. The dragon's glowing scales shimmered in response to emotions, forming colors that Elias could now understand better: warmth, safety, pride, and trust. He felt honored to be part of this bond. Time passed slowly but peacefully. Elias explored the clearing with the hatchlings, teaching them simple lessons about balance, climbing, and the terrain. The older dragons joined occasionally, demonstrating movements and flying patterns. The hatchlings responded with eager attempts, chirping and glowing in delight with every small success. Elias could see the growth and learning taking place, a living proof of resilience and trust. By afternoon, the hatchlings were tired and returned to Elias, curling against his chest once more. He lay back on the soft moss, the older dragons settling nearby, wings half spread in a relaxed posture. The valley was quiet except for the soft whispers of the wind. Elias closed his eyes briefly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. They had survived together and now life could continue, peaceful and strong. He thought about the storm, the shadows, and the unknown creatures that had threatened them. Each challenge had brought them closer, forcing Elias and the dragons to rely on instinct, trust, and courage. They had learned from each other, strengthened their bond, and now shared a quiet victory. Elias smiled as he felt the hatchlings stir, tiny eyes blinking up at him with trust and warmth. As the sun began to dip behind the cliffs, painting the sky with gold and pink, Elias knew that the valley would remain their home, a place of safety and learning. The older dragons emitted soft hums, sending flickers of color across their scales, signaling peace and connection. Elias wrapped his arms around the hatchlings, feeling their trust and warmth. They were safe, alive, and part of something greater than themselves. Elias whispered softly, "We will face whatever comes next, together." The hatchlings blinked their glowing eyes and snuggled closer, and the older dragons flared their wings gently in response. The valley held them in quiet harmony. It was a place of life, of unity, and of hope. Elias looked at the sky, breathing in the clean air, and felt a sense of belonging that was stronger than fear, stronger than danger. The day ended with the valley bathed in twilight, the hatchlings asleep on Elias's chest, the older dragons resting nearby, and a soft glow filling the clearing. Elias watched the scene with a calm heart. Life had returned. Trust had endured. And the bond between human and dragon had grown into something unbreakable. Together they had survived storms, threats, and fear, and now harmony had been rekindled. The night settled gently over the valley. Elias felt the rhythm of the hatchlings' small breaths and the quiet hum of the older dragons. He closed his eyes, feeling their warmth and protection, knowing that they were safe. In the glow of scales and trust, he realized that life could be fragile, but bonds made with courage and care could endure anything. The valley was alive with hope and he was part of it.